And so the uncomfortable reality that that existed in the 1920s was that America needed Negro History Week to combat Jim Crow, which was, again, that system of laws and customs that enforced racial segregation and discrimination, again, throughout the United States, but most especially in the South. And so my question that I'll ask today is, who needs Black History Month 98 years later? Because if this is what they were dealing with back at the turn of the 20th century, well, I mean, yeah, it was bad. They were dealing with, lynchings and Jim Crow, and it was blatant racism back then. Oh, people are being lynched by the thousands. And if you want to know how many people were being lynched, just turn to Tuskegee. The Tuskegee Institute began keeping those lynching numbers, and they are in the thousands, well into the 60s. Well into the 60s, there are numbers well into the 60s. But the question is, who needs Black History Month 98 years later?
I'm Amy the Seventh with a message. It is all relevant knowledge, intelligence, beauty, elegance, wisdom in a prism. Free your brain from the prison. Be kind, be significant. Time to listen in. Be kind, be significant, live magnificent. It's time to listen in. Be kind, be significant. Time to listen in. What's up, everyone? It's your lady Amy the Seventh with another episode of Pretty Woman Speaks. And let me tell you, the devil, let me just say this, the devil is really trying me on not getting this episode done, but we're gonna get this episode done because it's all about pushing through. And for Black History Month, it is my job to honor my ancestors by persevering, by surviving, because I am not dealing with half of what they're dealing with, right? So I have no other excuse but to succeed. So take that how you will. But I wanted to run this episode. This will be part one of a series that I would like to do. And really the question I want to answer tonight is, who needs Black History Month? Now, this question was not something that I made up. This was brought to me by watching on the Ohio channel, History Channel, Ms. Dr. Holly McGee, and she's an associate professor of African American history at the University of Cincinnati. And to me, she is a gem because she is not the type to water down Black history. And for me, as I've been through this journey, and really just learning my roots and where I've come from, the whole idea of what America used to mean to me as a kid has changed. Now, do I love being American? Hell yeah, I do. This professor, her name,
and I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free.
You know, you could take freedom how you want because it's just history has proven it really doesn't matter what bracket that you make it to. Unfortunately, when you share a certain color of skin, there's always going to be an issue there based off of just the color of your skin. So you take it how you will when you really define what is freedom, especially here in America, when we know that freedom is, is subjective, because, and not even just subjective, it's controlled, because at a drop of a hat, your freedom can be snatched from you, almost like a rug pulled from underneath you. So, you take that how you will. But really what I wanted to discuss to you is that Black history, we've been celebrating Black history on paper for 98 years. Can you believe it? It was started by Carter G. Woodson in February of 1926 as Negro History Week. And I love the word Negro. I believe Negro, it changed from Negro to African American, I believe around the time when Jesse Jackson was running for president, running for some type of office, and he wanted to get away from the word Negro because it was attached to, I guess, a lot of pain in the Black communities.
Since 1619 and the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia, standard terminology to describe Africans living in America was colored or Negro. For over 360 years, as blacks were relegated to second-class citizenship, terms that reinforced oppression have been used to describe them. But as centuries pass, black people have at times fought to break free from derogatory labels. After the Civil War, several black people dispensed with the names given them by their former enslavers. This would continue even into the 1900s when, during the height of the civil rights movement, black leaders strongly rebelled against Jim Crow labels. But for mainstream America, a major turning point came in the late 1980s. On this day in 1988, a group of black leaders, including Reverend Jesse Jackson and representatives from the NAACP, met to discuss the national black agenda. It was here that Jackson and his peers catapulted the term African American into the country's lexicon. The term has been used since the 1970s, but never gained widespread acceptance until after this Chicago convention. Reverend Jackson said, "To be called African Americans has cultural integrity. It puts us in our proper historical context. Every ethnic group in this country has a reference to some land base, some historical cultural base. African Americans have hit that level of cultural maturity." Jackson stated that other races could connect their heritage to their mother countries with a sense of pride and acceptance. The term rose to prominence because it was considered more appropriate than black or colored.
So we switched over to African American, and to me, I think it was a bit of a disservice to us to leave behind the word Negro. And Dr. Holly McGee shares the same sentiment.
Another difficulty is language, right? So I've spent so much time using the phrasing, this politically correct phrasing of African American. African American, Black. Every now and again, you'll hear me in my classes use the word Negro. Uh-oh. She said a word. Oh. She said Negro. Oh. Yes, I did. Oh, there's so many other alternatives. I teach a class called African American History from, actually, the university has me teach a class. It's called African American History from, what does the university have it called? The university says African American History from, what did they say? From something to 1861. I think they say from slavery to 1861 is what they say. I refuse. I refuse to teach African American history as something that begins on the shores of British North colonial America. Absolutely refuse, because that's not where African American history starts. So I teach African American history as something that starts African American history from Africa, right? From Africa to George Floyd. That's what I teach, right? And so when I teach my students from Africa to George Floyd, then I'm able to teach them language, right? And I talk to them about the iteration of language. And I teach them racial slurs. I absolutely do. I teach them racial slurs. And the reason you teach students racial slurs is because they need to understand. They need to understand that racial slurs are outdated language from a racist past. And if you can teach them that this is outdated language from a racist past, well, then you can teach students out of that ignorance. And if you can teach them to associate that language with an ignorant, outdated racist past, they'll feel foolish using it in the present day. You need to normalize teaching that as an ignorant methodology, as an ignorant mindset. You need to normalize those things, normalize teaching that as ignorant, so then we can move forward as a society.
I mean, if you go back to certain 15th, 16th century maps, you could find the word Negro land on the map of Africa, right? So, I think that there needs to be a time where we go and revisit who we were before, our history started as just slaves, right? Because that is how United States history has watered down African American history, essentially, as we were just slaves. But if you have the opportunity to really walk yourself through who many of us were before we were just chained to sharecropping, we were just chained to slaves. slaves into son of John or son of James. You get the understanding that we were kings and queens. We were the brightest mind out of the continent of Africa. So I implore you all to have the opportunity to do so. And so where she starts it off when she talks about this is not just your grandmother's African American Negro history, Black history sermon. She starts at shattering the myth of the American dream. And I can remember when I was first awoke, the word woke, where at one point in time when the word woke was very sacred, at least when I was coming along into my enlightenment journey. Now it's taking on a very white wing journey tone where you don't want to become woke because woke in their mind takes on a anti tone to them.
Thanks to the overwhelming support of the people of Florida, we not only won election, we have rewritten the political map. We reject woke ideology. We fight the woke in the legislature. We fight the woke in the schools. We fight the woke in the corporations. We will never, ever surrender to the woke mob. Florida is where woke goes to die.
And so I implore you to actually look into what they think about wokeness versus what woke meant to us at one point in time. And to me, when I was coming around my woke journey, took my very first African American history class at Florida A&M. Woo, strike again, go Rattlers. I took about that class in 2012, and I don't remember my African American history professor, so forgive me. But I took her class, and when I really learned how majority of us Black Americans was indoctrinated into Christianity, when I learned that our history actually started more than just slave history, that we were the bright minds, I was angry and I was upset. And Dr. Holly McGee talks about how when the narrative is changed, it throws us into a loop.
And you become so normalized with that all other narratives fall to the wayside. Well, when a new narrative is introduced, it's challenging to what you think you know. And so those feelings of guilt, anger, depression, when they rise up inside of you, when they rise up inside of students, it can be very difficult when those feelings make you challenge internally those things which you thought you knew. So that's something that's very difficult for students to have to deal with. Pronouns, when we normalize American history narratives as opposed to African American history narratives, that's incredibly difficult for students. I've spent a lot of time in the classroom dealing with predominantly white students. In my classroom spaces, I deal with predominantly white students. And in those classroom spaces, it's very difficult for students who have never had to think about how they communicate in a classroom, right? When you have to think about well, we did this and we did that. And I have to stop my students and I say, I'm sorry, were you alive in the 19th century? Were you a land owning, white yeoman farmer in the 18th century? Well, then you shouldn't be owning this. You should use proper language. You should use, 18th century slaves did this. 19th century yeoman farmers did that. Not we, not you, not our. And so, we need to teach students into these things, but we can't teach them into these things if we shy away from incorporating these narratives into our educational systems. Curriculum neglect, the fact that we center and prioritize repeatedly American history, U.S. history, and we shy away from other narratives of American history. Because let me say this to you, African American history is American history.
And so when you really understand that a lot of American history has been watered down, you go through the period of, as I say, you're angry, and as Dr. Holly McGee said, you have these motions of disenchantment, right? Because all along American history teaches you to be enchanted with certain parts of American history, right? Because it does a great job of watering down the actual realities of things. And so she also goes into talking about the turn of the 20th century, where they label this the progressive period, but really it was just a period of a very low point of America, because we're experiencing massacres at this point of like Tulsa massacre, Rosewood. You're also experiencing a lot of lynchings happening. If you never learned about Ida B. Wells, she was a journalist at that time who wrote about a lot of race relations, a lot of lynchings in the area. And when you learn like how language really got started, like how the word picnic really started from that of whites joining in on picking out a Negro that they want at that time, and stringing him into a tree, that forbidden fruit, and then gathering around and joining in on that as they considered fun, and they would essentially have food, right? So this was their picnic at that time. And so, um I think, what Dr. Holly McGee was getting at is that when we get to a point that America really start accepting who she is, who she was, and the type of terror that she has wreaked over many different um, um, ethnicities in this country, then we could start actually healing, because we broaden our narrative out of just what we know all the time as just the Rosa Parks, the Martin Luther King, the same narratives that we get over and over and over again. And so I think it's very interesting that we're still at the point where this part of our history is continuing to be watered down. And you get this all the time, especially when we have a mass shooting in this country, and then a president or one of our politicians come forward and they say, this is not who we are as a country. But in reality, this is exactly who we are. And until we accept it and embrace it and start having the conversation of that this is who we are, but this is no longer who we want to be, then we could change those things. And Dr. Holly McGee actually speaks to that narrative a lot.
And so the truth of the matter was is that it was open season on Black bodies in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. And this meant racial chaos. I am a big fan, as a historian, I'm a big fan of turning to newspapers, Black newspapers, white newspapers. I'm a big fan of turning to newspapers to really find out about what happens in a society. You can look at a newspaper and you can see the hopes, the fears, the imaginative dreams, and even the frightening realities of what's happening in a city, what's happening in a country. And when you look at newspapers in the United States at the turn of the 20th century, this is what you see. You see riots continue, riot at South Omaha. And you see this, and I've purposefully not just pulled newspapers from the South. I've pulled newspapers from Nebraska. I've pulled newspapers from Colorado. I've pulled newspapers from everywhere. But you want to keep in mind, when you see things that talk about race riots, when you see things at the turn of the 20th century that say 432 Negroes murdered, 2 whites shot, that's not a race riot. That's a massacre. When you see 232 Blacks murdered, 3 whites dead, that's not a race riot. That's a murder. And you see this happening at the turn of the 20th century across the United States, not just in the South. This is the low point of race relations because it is open season on Blacks, men, women, and children across the United States.
And so this is where you get Carter G. Woodson. If you never read his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, I implore you to read it. But he was, an amazing man. My mother and I, we went to a symposium of him at the Charles, what is that? 3 3, 2, 1. And so this is the reason why you get Carter G. Woodson, because he was tired of that narrative, coon, coon, coon. He was tired of the psychological impact of the onslaught of just ignorance from one counterpart, the hatefulness, the ugly realities of what Black Americans was experiencing at the turn of the 20th century. Just tired of all the racism, the lynchings, the just the onslaught of just hate that Black Americans was experiencing.
In 1901, take a look at the top right-hand corner of your screen. In 1901, the most successful song in the United States was Coon, Coon, Coon. You cannot tell me that the United States is in a progressive era if the #1 song being sung everywhere is Coon, Coon, Coon. Now, you can even find this song. It's being played on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube. When we get off of this call, anyone who's interested, go to YouTube, type in 1901 most successful song. You can find Coon, Coon, Coon. At this turn, this is the low point of race relations. Black communities like Tulsa, Elaine, at the turn of the 20th century, Tulsa and Elaine are only two of the most well-known race riots, pardon me, Black communities that were being massacred. Tulsa, Elaine, Rosewood, these are three of the most well-known, but there were dozens of Black communities across the United States where they were simply bombed, beaten, raped, burned, shot out of existence, simply because they were self-sufficient, they offered some type of economic competition, or they simply existed outside of the confines or outside of the authority of some local white town or some local white administrator. They simply existed. This is the low point of race relations in the United States.
And that's why Carter G. Woodson introduced the Negro History Week in February of 1926, because he wanted to show something positive. He was tired of Jim Crow, and quite frankly, I wasn't. And also another person, although he was 20 years after Carter G. Woodson, that introduced more positive images, was John H. Johnson of Ebony and Jet magazine. He was also tired of negative images. He said he never saw a Black man in a tie in a magazine until he did it right. So it just goes to point out that when you're tired of a certain narrative that's being put forward, that it is incumbent on you to change what it is that you see, to change what it is that you hear. And two of those people that really did it was Carter G. Woodson and also John H. Johnson, but he's not somebody I'm really going to talk to. But if you never learned about John H. Johnson, he was actually the first Black man to be in the Fortune 400. The Fortune 400 was John H. Johnson, and he was also the first Black person to own commercial real estate on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, Illinois. And if you know Michigan Avenue, it is prime lakefront real estate, and he was the first Black man to do it. So I implore you to really learn about who John H. Johnson is. But nevertheless, Carter G. Woodson, he wrote the book The Miseducation of the Negro, and then he also put forth the Negro History Week. And Dr. Holly McGee really speaks more in depth about what that meant to Black Americans during this time of Jim Crow.
And because of this, society needed a psychological corrective. Enter Carter G. Woodson. Enter Carter G. Woodson. So Black History Month, as we know it today, it was originally conceived as Negro History Week in February of 1926. And so Carter G. Woodson originally intended this as an educational medium. This first week, he wanted it to be an educational medium because what he wanted to do, he wanted to provide an opportunity for multiple aspects of Black history and the Black experience in America to reach wide audiences. Listen, what he wanted to do was to disseminate positive information and positive images about Blacks to society at large. If you think about it, he wanted to do the same thing that W.E.B. Du Bois wanted to do when he encouraged Blacks to fight in World War I. He thought, W.B. Du Bois and Woodson, Carter G. Woodson believed, if we can humanize ourselves in the eyes of America and in the eyes of whites, they won't treat us like dogs. They won't kill us like dogs in the streets. Because the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment weren't really doing anything. I think today we have a saying about baseball, right? We have a saying about the sport of baseball, that baseball is America's first great pastime. That simply is not the case. We say that, and we do, we say that that baseball is America's first great pastime. That's not the case. America's first great pastime was lynching. At the turn of the 20th century, America's first great pastime was lynching. Nothing brought ethnic whites together. At the turn of the 20th century, nothing brought ethnic whites together better than lynching. If you wanted to get, Germans and Irishmen and Hungarians to forget their class differences and their ethnic differences, if you wanted them to forget all those things, all you needed to do was run an ad in the newspaper and say, hey, we're going to be stringing up some Negroes this weekend. And if you think that didn't happen in the United States, you are sadly mistaken. And so what Carter G. Woodson wanted to do was to disseminate positive images, positive information. He wanted to change that psychology. He wanted to change that negative constellation of ideas that had been existing in the United States for hundreds of years that allowed for Blacks to be treated with impunity. He wanted to change that. Man, you can legislate the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. That's great, but you can't legislate the hearts and minds. And this is what Negro History Week was this is what Negro History Week was intended to address. And so generations later, the recognition of that week grew to encompass a month. And this February marks the 98th anniversary of Black History Month.
I think what's interesting is that you really think you're so far removed, because that's just how American history makes it seem like, like the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing actually happened like just 20 plus years before I was born. But when I was in grade school, it just seemed like it was eons away, but that was not the case. And then when I talked to my grandmother, and she was a sharecropper, my grandmother actually lived on 3 plantations. That's actually Amy the Fifth. And she lived on 3 plantations by the age of 12. And so when you think about that, that was my grandmother. And when I count back, I'm only 5th generation removed from slavery. So this is not far at all, right? Because that just essentially means that my grandmother's great grandmother was a slave. And so when you really think about it, you're not that far removed.
And so the uncomfortable reality that existed in the 1920s was that America needed Negro History Week to combat Jim Crow, which was, again, that system of laws and customs that enforced racial segregation and discrimination, again, throughout the United States, but most especially in the South. And so my question that I'll ask today is, who needs Black History Month 98 years later? Because if this is what they were dealing with back at the turn of the 20th century, well, I mean, yeah, it was bad. They were dealing with, lynchings and Jim Crow, and it was blatant racism back then. Oh, people are being lynched by the thousands. And if you want to know how many people are being lynched, just turn to Tuskegee. The Tuskegee Institute began keeping those lynching numbers, and they are in the thousands, well into the 60s. Well into the 60s, there are numbers well into the 60s. But the question is, who needs Black History Month 98 years later?
And so that's where I'm going to stick a pin at for us to build upon for part 2 of who needs Black history. I mean, because Dr. Holly McGee goes more in depth of what is polite Negro history, and we also speak more into why do we need Black History Month 98 years later. I mean, look at us. I mean, we're fly. We got our own TV networks. We on radios. Albeit only just 100 of us out of 4,200 radio station across the country. I think only less than 100 of us own our own radio station, including Charlie Chuck in Toledo, whose daughter now is the president of WJUC. If you never heard of WJUC, I implore you to support one of the few only Black-owned radio stations that I know about, to support them. But when you think about it, we have Black billionaires now. We're in tech. We're in real estate. But really, when you think about where we are in comparison to our counterparts Is the need for Black history still needed? Are we really learning about all the revolutionary game changers, inventors that we were? Do we still need Black History Month 98 years later? So that is what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to go more into Dr. Holly McGee's segment on who needs Black History Month 98 years later. But I appreciate y'all for tuning in for another episode of Amy the Seventh here for Pretty Woman Speaks, and I hope that y'all learned something, because I've learned a lot and I wanted to share that with you all. So peace and love, and tune in each and every Monday for another episode of Amy the Seventh.
I'm Amy the Seventh with a message.